So, why do right wingers hate cities so much? It's a question I've grappled with for a long time because I more or less identify as being on the right. At least, let me put it this way, right wingers accept me more than left wingers do. I mean, given the fact that I have a lot of views that are considered extremely unkosher with the left. So, despite that, I have this extreme difference from them in this regard. So, why is it? Because every time I go into the comments section on any right wing website or any Facebook page, right wing Facebook page or anything of the sort, whenever the subject of, the urban versus rural or urban versus suburban debate comes up, almost unanimously, all the people just talk about how much they hate cities and how cities are just the worst place imaginable, and how they imagine instead this pastoral bucolic countryside existence as being the alternative, or in some cases they imagine this kind of 1950s-esque suburban lifestyle as the preferable alternative. But either way, regardless of whether they seem to prefer rural areas, small towns, or suburban areas, or whatever, they nearly all seem to hate big cities. And I notice this especially among the rank and file, because sometimes among leaders, like say Mike Enoch, for instance, or Richard Spencer or whoever, they seem to not hate cities as much, which really leads me to think that there is a disconnect between the leadership and the rank and file on this issue, as there are on many others. But I think it also speaks to a certain psychological tendency, and I can kind of understand what it is. As I've said in one of my previous videos, I think a lot of it has to do with dopamine versus serotonin. I think dopamine-driven people probably tend to more sway toward leadership positions. They tend to be more strongly driven in some ways, more passionate, very larger than life type people. I would call Mike Enoch, for instance, a very larger than life type person. And people like that who are more dopamine driven probably tend to prefer big cities a lot more. Whereas people who are more serotonin driven, for instance, they'll say things like, all I want is to be left alone. All I want is a quiet life where I'm not interfered with by the government or by society, by whatever. People who say things like that their goal in life is just to be left alone, I think that's a very serotonin driven sentiment. That's those are the types of people who do prefer the countryside. And I think to some extent it is about a difference in psychology. And I think the issues why they say they hate cities can be a bit of a red herring, because, for instance, they'll say they hate cities because of the crime, but then even if they were offered the chance to live in a city with a low crime rate, like say Quebec City or certain cities in Eastern Europe that are 95% white and have a low crime rate, I think they would still reject that. Because I think at the end of the day, yes, crime is an issue in cities. Crime does tend to be worse in cities on average, even though there can be suburbs and small towns that also have high crime rates. But yes, I mean, I will concede on average cities are worse for crime. But I honestly don't think it's entirely about crime as they make it sound, because they just really seem to, a lot of these people just seem to really have a preference for places that are just quiet and that aren't very stimulating sensation wise. Some of them will even go so far as to say they prefer boring places in the countryside. They wouldn't want to live, say, in somewhere like Banff or Jasper or Canmore or whatever, somewhere with mountains nearby. They'd actually prefer to live somewhere with a boring landscape. And I think that says a lot. I do think the whole desire for the slower paced life and frankly lack of visual stimulation, I think psychologically some of these people actually prefer that. For instance, a lot of people, they idealize the Shire in Lord of the Rings, and I think that very much stems from that, the idea to be in this really slow paced kind of boring place that's maybe kind of pretty but not awe-inspiringly beautiful. Whereas someone like me would prefer to live somewhere like Minas Tirith, or Lake Town, like not this like kind of middle of nowhere pastoral existence, but rather a city that is more grand. And even if I did live in a rural area, I'd want to live among like mountains or something like that. So again, I think it does come down to a very an underlying psychological difference. Like some people, for whatever reason, they prefer boring places. They actually like they dislike too much visual stimulation, too much hubbub. Like, and I'm not saying I want to live in like a super loud place, but like I would like living in like say like a traditional medium density neighborhood, like some of the neighborhoods in the older parts of Toronto, for instance. I wouldn't really want to live somewhere like Manhattan where it's just super dense and super crowded. But again, like Manhattan has its function too. I mean, there are people who that appeals to, and I don't necessarily begrudge them that either. And I definitely disagree with the idea that like cities are useless for anything except degeneracy, because it's like if you look historically, cities have been the center of a lot of scientific innovation, art, culture. Like that's where all the museums are. It's where the universities are. And yes, I mean, universities have produced scientific, mathematical, technological innovation too. Like they don't just produce like pause and cuckoldry. Like that's more of a recent thing. And that's more against certain departments. But it's not like there's nothing that universities have ever produced that's positive. It's just unfortunately that's how they're becoming. And I think, yes, it's true that historically and today, cities have always had lower birth rates than the surrounding countryside. But my question is that always a problem? Like, if you have a society that has a healthy birth rate overall, like, is it a problem that some people will go to the city and have maybe either no children or fewer children? I mean, I honestly think the world is overpopulated to start out with, but regardless, I mean, if the net average birth rate is sustainable, then like, who cares if some people aren't having as many kids? Plus, it's a trade off because it's like those people in the cities who aren't having as many kids are also contributing more potentially toward scientific advancement, technological advancement, research, just all kinds of cultural institutions. So it's like there's a bit of a trade off, like the birth rate is a bit lower, but the trade-off for that is that they are contributing to certain things that like rural people are not. And again, rural people are contributing to things that city people are not. Like for instance, farming food, that's a huge contribution. A lot of mining, forestry work, stuff like that. But at the same time, yeah, it's like for whatever reason, cities do tend to lower birth rates. But it's like, okay, is that necessarily a problem? As I've said, if the birth rate is sustainable overall. But anyway, yeah, looking at the purported reasons why right wingers hate cities, like the number one reason that they give is, well, basically crime and demographics. And I guess also like the fact that there's more liberals in cities. And these are all valid reasons. I don't deny that these can be annoyances of living in a city. And at time, in terms of crime, it can be outright dangerous. But at the same time, like I think I tend to view a more holistic approach where I look at other aspects too that maybe a lot of these people aren't thinking about. Like, for instance, obesity rates are proven to be higher on average in rural areas, small towns, and suburban areas than in large cities. It's proven statistically, at least in the United States and probably in many other countries. And I think that's largely because people in cities, they walk more, they take transit more, whereas in a lot of other areas, people drive literally everywhere. And you can try to deny it all day, but the fact is there is a proven link between driving everywhere and being fat. Because driving does not require any sort of physical exercise. It doesn't make you any thinner, whereas walking does. And you could argue like, oh, but in the suburbs, you can go for walks. It's like, yes, you can go for walks. You have the option of going for walks. I mean, if you live in a suburb that has good trails and stuff, like some suburbs don't even have sidewalks. But again, that's not necessarily all suburbs. I'll grant that. However, here's the difference. In a city, you have to walk. In a suburb or certain small towns, it's optional. You could drive everywhere if you want to, and most people do because that's in many ways the easier way to get around. So the thing is, if you don't have to walk, many people won't, and it's simply because they won't have the time for it. Like, especially people with children, they often just do not have the time to schedule time in their day to just go for a walk for the sake of going for a walk. So, like, the difference is living in a city, you have to walk, so you don't have to schedule time for it. You don't have to, like, say, oh, I'm going to go for a walk at 7 p.m. after dinner. No, you're going to have to walk as part of your commute, as part of your daily routine. You're forced to, whether you have the time for it or not. And I think that's a huge thing that people don't take into account, is the fact that the urban lifestyle does keep people more physically fit. And it's like, okay, people on the right talk about physical fitness. They talk about obesity being a problem, but they refuse to acknowledge the link between car dependency and just a suburbanized or just low density type car dependent existence and obesity. Like, they will not acknowledge this correlation. Like, most right wingers refuse to accept it because it's inconsistent with their worldview. They want to believe that cities are worse in every way and that there's no advantage to living in cities, and that suburban areas and rural areas are superior in every way and there's no disadvantage to living in them. So that's one right there, the obesity factor. Another factor is danger of car accidents. Like, you are more likely to get in a car accident the more you drive. And also, you're probably, I would say, yet more likely as a pedestrian if you're in a place where people tend to drive really fast. Like, I don't know, I've seen conflicting statistics on this, but I have heard from some sources that people in suburban areas and rural areas are in more danger of dying in car-related fatalities or getting injured severely than people in urban areas. And I have seen this backed up by some statistics. Like, if you look at the most dangerous U.S. states for car accidents, car-related fatalities per capita, like, I think Wyoming is number one. And I think some of these southern states like Alabama, I think, might be pretty high. But my point, I don't think states like New York are very high on this list. So that would tend to support what I'm saying here. Like, again, I have seen some conflicting statistics on this, but I think overall the majority of statistics seem to indicate that you are in more danger of dying in car accidents if you live in a rural or suburban area. Regardless, here's one statistic that there is no conflict on. You are more likely by far to die in a car-related accident than to be murdered in the United States. And in most developed countries, I think probably almost every developed country, the car accident fatality rate is significantly higher than the murder rate. So the question is, like, okay, right-wingers are always talking about the danger of being murdered. And granted, that is a real danger, especially if you live in certain high-crime places. But they never talk about the danger of dying in a car accident, even though it's proven that, like, you know, the car fatality, like the accident fatality rates tend to be lower in countries like in Europe, for instance, where people don't drive as much, where people take transit more and they walk more because they're spending less time in their cars, and also because the roads aren't just designed for cars, they're designed for people. So the roads tend to discourage speeding and reckless driving, whereas the way the roads are designed in countries like the US and Canada often encourages it. And you have to ask, like, why is it that right-wingers, and frankly left-wingers too, like, nobody seems to really talk about how high the car accident fatality rate is in countries like the US, but yet they freak out over other issues like crime and COVID. Well, I mean, frankly, it's like what the Joker says in The Dark Knight, because it's part of the plan. That's honestly my thinking. Like, people don't take car accidents into account because it's part of the plan. It's just supposed to be an accepted danger of day-to-day life. And nobody cares about that. But if one person within a square mile of you gets murdered, everyone loses their minds. Like, when you do in a suburban area, when you have the occasional murder, people will absolutely freak out. Like, if there was like one murder within like 5 square miles of where they live, they will like freak the fuck out. So, like, why is it that people think that way? Like, why people accept certain types of dangers and yet ignore others? Like, again, like, it's because it's part of the plan, because certain dangers are considered aberrant, whereas others are just considered a fact of life. But if you look at Europe, you can see that having a car accident related fatality rate this high actually isn't an inevitable fact of life. It isn't something unchangeable. You can actually change it by simply having a society that's less dependent on cars and more dependent on transit and walking. But the thing is, people don't think of it that way. They think of it as this is just a fact of life. Like, something every bit as inevitable as having to breathe air. So I don't know. Like, I mean, these are all things. And another thing that I take into account that I think a lot of these people don't is, frankly, yes, I mean, it does have to do with my psychology to an extent. Like, I'm a dopamine driven person. I have ADHD. I am more what they would call sensation driven. I like places that are not boring. I like places that have some kind of beauty, some type of visual stimulation, something to do. But at the same time, I think a lot of right wingers confuse that with like degeneracy. They think that, like, if you're a dopamine driven person, it must mean that you just want to like go to like sex clubs and fuck as many people as possible and just do a bunch of drugs. And it's like, yeah, those are certain pathways to activating your dopamine receptors, but there's pathways that aren't bad, like looking at beautiful architecture, looking at beautiful nature, going to a museum and seeing beautiful art. Like, these are all ways of being stimulated in that same way that aren't inherently degenerate, and in some ways actually are positive in the sense that they contribute toward an appreciation of culture and heritage, and in both a human sense and a natural sense. And this is something that a lot of these people don't take into account. These like, oh, cities suck, oh, what's really trad is to find the most, not just a rural area, but the most boring rural area possible, the most flat, barren, fucking heartland rural area. And it's like, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's inherently degenerate to want more than that. It's like, oh, God forbid, I don't find fucking Smallville exciting. And speaking of which, people, they criticized the movie Man of Steel for having too much product placement in the Smallville fight scene, but it's like, that's literally what most of middle America is actually like. Like, you go to the downtowns, and when, insofar as anything is not abandoned, you just see like chain stores everywhere with their big signs and logos. Like, that's an accurate depiction of middle America. And it's like, people on the right talk about how our cities have become ugly, and that's true. There has been a lot of destruction of beautiful architecture in many cities. But at the same time, I would argue the cities in many ways still have more beauty than a lot of other places. Like, there's still a lot more traditional architecture in a city like Boston or Philadelphia or New York or Washington, D.C. than there is in your typical like middle American small town. A lot of middle American small towns are just, yeah, they're like that scene in Man of Steel where it's just everything's corporate. And a lot of them are just devoid of much architectural or natural beauty. Like, I'm sorry, but it's true. Like, a lot of middle America, middle Canada, like the places that are considered flyover country are just lacking in visual appeal, like architecture, nature, whatever. And I mean, I know it hurts to hear it because I know a lot of people on the right idealize this region, but it's true. And it's true, I'm not saying that this is something unique to the heartland. Like, I mean, there's a lot of hideous suburbs of coastal cities as well. And some of the cities themselves can be fairly hideous, especially the more modernist ones. I'm not denying that. But at the same time, like, I do think that, people, they say like, oh, you're longing for this type of urban existence that just doesn't exist anymore. I could see the same thing. It's like when you're idealizing Hobbiton, you're longing for a type of small town existence that largely doesn't exist anymore. Like the average small town is much more like the corporate logos everywhere in Smallville in Man of Steel than it is like Hobbiton. And that's just a fact. I'm sorry if it hurts to hear it, but it's a fact. Like people talk about the uglification of our cities, but it's like, what about the uglification of our small towns? A lot of our small towns are just, a lot of the historic buildings are gone. Or if there are historic buildings, they're often just on the one street. And past that street, it's basically just like suburbia. Or houses that look like the house on the cover of the Marshall Mathers LP. That sort of thing. And it's like, okay, like I've lived in this type of place too. Like I do know what I'm talking about. I lived in it. I've been through it. Like I'm familiar with both types of the North American continent, like the heartland and the coast, the flyover and the big places, whatever. And frankly, like I just think there's a lot of tunnel vision on the right where they're only willing to see the problems of the cities and not willing to see the problems of the small towns, suburbs, and rural areas. And that's not even getting into the drug addiction problems. Like granted, drug addiction can be a huge problem in the cities too. But I don't know. It's just, I really think that we need to take a more holistic view of all these things. And that's pretty much my position on that.